A Day in the Life of Henry Reed by Keith Robertson. Henry Reed is spending the summer with an aunt and uncle in Grover's Corner, New Jersey. There isn't much to do in Grover's Corner, which consists of only 9 houses. Even if there were, there's only one person to do anything with, Midge Glass, and Midge is a girl. Still, Henry manages to find plenty to fill the daily journal he's keeping. The following entry from Henry's journal is one of the many that appears in the book. Henry Reed, Inc. Not too much has happened since my last entry. Last night, I went with the Glasses to the outdoor movies, which I enjoyed a lot. The reason we went to the outdoor movies was that we didn't have any lights in Grover's Corner last night. The reason we didn't have any lights is connected in a way with something Midge and I did. The Ainsworths, who live down near where the new house is being built, had a wasps' nest in the mulberry tree out near their chicken house. Midge heard about it and went over to look at it several days ago. It was one of those great big gray paper nests that wasps build, and I'd only seen one of them before. Most of the wasps around here just build sort of open cones underneath the eaves of buildings and don't make a paper covering around them. This was one of the biggest wasp nests I've seen, even bigger than the ones in the Museum of Natural History when I visited there 2 years ago. "I'd like to have that," I said. "Why?" Midge asked. "Is it full of honey?" I explained that wasps don't store honey like bees do. They kill spiders and flies and store them away instead. Midge don't know even the simplest facts about insects and animals. "Then what do you want it for?" Midge asked. "I'd like to look at it," I said. "The wasps knew how to make paper before people did. Besides, we might be able to sell it." "Who'd want a wasp's nest?" Midge asked. "A museum," I replied. She didn't think much of the idea, but I asked Mrs. Ainsworth if she minded if I took the wasp's nest. She said certainly not. In fact, she would gladly pay me $1 if I would take it away. Midge was a little more in favor of the idea then, and agreed to help me. "We could hang it up near the barn," I said. "And the wasps would eat all the spiders on the second floor." "Nothing doing," Midge said flatly. "There's not room enough in this room for the wasp and me too. Have you ever been stung by a wasp?" I'd never been stung by a wasp, although I had been stung by bees. Midge said it wasn't the same thing at all. Finally, I agreed that we wouldn't try to preserve the wasps, just the nest. We found a 5-gallon can that seemed like the perfect container, and we went over to get the nest. I borrowed Mrs. Ainsworth's ladder and got it up against the tree without any trouble. I was about 2/3 of the way up the ladder with a saw in my hand, planning to saw off the limb with the nest on when I got stung. Midge was right. A wasp's sting is nothing like a bee's sting. It really hurts. I decided right then and there that I wasn't going to get the nest until I had the proper equipment. I asked Uncle Al that night if he knew where I could buy a can of smoke that beekeepers use. Naturally, he wanted to know what I was going to use it for. I told him that I wanted to get rid of some wasps. "Your mother liked bees and you like wasps," he said, shaking his head. "I suppose you'll be stung less if you have the smoke than you don't have it. Frankly, my advice is to stay as far away from wasps as possible. I've put off painting like the eaves of that garage out there for 2 years because of those wasps." He got me the smoke yesterday morning, and I got out my mother's old bee equipment. The net was full of holes, but Aunt Mabel made me a new net out of an old curtain. The net is attached to the head at the top and comes down over my shoulders. There are 2 drawstrings to pull it tight around your chest and under my arms. After I got the net on, I put on a jacket and some long gloves. Then I was practically stain-proof. I tried out my suit first on the wasp's nest under the eaves of Uncle El's garage. These weren't the kind of wasps that build the big paper nests, of course, and they weren't very interesting. But my net worked perfectly, and I didn't bother using any smoke. I simply climbed up on a stepladder and knocked all the cones down. The wasps buzzed around my head, as mad as could be, but they couldn't get through to sting me. Next, we went over to Mrs. Answorth's, and I put up the ladder again. I climbed to the top, not paying any attention to the wasps. When I got up to the nest, I gave it several shots from my smoke can. I wasn't worried about them stinging me. But I knew that when I started sawing off the limb, they would really get mad. Midge was holding the ladder, and she didn't have any net. Everything went perfectly, which shows that if you plan in advance, you can do almost anything without any trouble. I sawed off the outer ends of the limb first, then sawed it again between the trees and the nest. That left the nest hanging on the little piece of limb, about a foot long, which I was holding. I had poked a tiny hole in the lid of the can and had threaded a little piece of wire through this. I climbed down with the nest, hung it to the little wire loop in the lid, and put the lid carefully on the can. Midge had retreated to the corner of the house where she stood watching. There were quite a few wasps who were out hunting, and I stood there for a few minutes watching them as they came back. They looked pretty silly zooming in, expecting to find a great big nest and instead finding nothing but empty space. I suppose a person would feel the same way if he arrived home to find that a hurricane had blown away his house. I felt a little bit mean, because I certainly played those wasps a dirty trick. I felt even sorrier for the wasps that were in the nest inside the can. They were prisoners and would starve to death. At least the others would start over again. Midge didn't seem to feel a bit sorry for any of them, though. She said that she hoped all of them got their stingers doubled over trying to sting the tin can. I picked up the can and we started back toward the barn. As we passed the new house, we noticed that a bulldozer was digging a hole off to one side of the house. "Maybe they are going to have a swimming pool," Midge said hopefully. "But I don't know why they didn't start on that first instead of the house. Half the summer's gone." "I doubt if it's a swimming pool," I said. "It doesn't look big enough." "Then what is it?" The bulldozer was digging dirt out of the hole and pushing it into a low spot up near the front of the lot. "Wait until he comes back up here and we'll ask him," I said. I set the can down beside the road and climbed up the bank to watch the bulldozer. Midge joined me a minute later. The bulldozer came chugging toward us, and Midge waved her hand. "Is that a swimming pool?" she shouted. "No such luck!" the driver shouted back. "Digging out for the footing for a garage." He had stopped the bulldozer to answer Midge, but now he started again, distributing the dirt around evenly along the front part of the lot. A plumber's truck came tearing down the road and turned into the driveway. The man was driving much faster than he should have been, and I suppose he didn't realize that he had reached the driveway until the last minute. He slammed on his brakes, his tires screeched, and he skidded round the turn into the driveway. I had set the can well out of the way, I thought. It would have been for any ordinary driver, but not for this cowboy. His rear bumper just touched the can, but that was enough to knock it over. It rolled down into the ditch, and the lid came off. "Look out! Wasps!" Midge shouted at the top of her voice, and she took off like a streak for the front of the lot. I had put my bee hat and net and gloves and can of smoke on top of the can when I set it down beside the road. They fell down into the ditch with the can and couldn't get to them. I waited a few seconds, but when I saw those wasps coming out of that can like a black cloud, I decided to follow Midge. "Look out! Those are wasps!" I yelled to the bulldozer driver in case he hadn't heard Midge. He said later that he hadn't heard either one of us. The first thing he knew about the wasps was that he had been stung on the neck. They zoomed in on him like a bombing squadron, and then all around him at once. He started swinging his arms round like mad. And then he noticed that he was heading for the ditch. He gave the wheel a yank and started swinging at the wasps again. But this time they're really after him. Later, he counted 15 wasp stings, so I suppose most of the time he didn't know what was happening. Finally, he decided that the only thing to do was to stop the bulldozer and to get out of there. By the time it was too late, just as he stopped it, it banged against the light pole beside the driveway. The bulldozer wasn't going fast, but the ground was soft beside the light pole, and it was just a temporary pole. It didn't break off, but it leaned over at about a 45-degree angle. It reached far enough to hit against the main lines at the road and stamp one of them. By this time, the wasps had reached the house, and they were still after blood. They chased the mason and the 2 carpenters out of there and stoned all 3 of them. The man who had caused all the trouble, the plumber, didn't get stung at all. After a few minutes passed, I found a long stick and I slipped back out by the road. I managed to get my hat and net and put this on. Then I walked down into the ditch, got my gloves, and put the lid back on the can. Most of the wasps had left the nest. It had broken into 3 or 4 pieces. I was pretty sore at that plumber for ruining my wasp nest, but there wasn't much point in complaining. I couldn't ask him to pay for the nest because I didn't know what it was worth. I decided to say nothing. Besides, I thought it might be just as well if that bulldozer operator didn't know where the wasps came from. I dumped what remained of the nest out in the alfalfa field in back of the lot and put away my bee equipment. I hadn't seen a sign of Midge since the can was knocked in the ditch. As I came out of the barn, she came across the street. "Where have you been?" I asked. "I went back to collect that dollar from Mrs. Ainsworth," she said. "I thought maybe I'd better get it before she tried to cook dinner tonight." "What's that got to do with it?" "She's got an electric stove," Midge said. "In case you haven't heard, there isn't any power in Grover's Corner." She was right. Somebody phoned the power company, and they promised to be out as soon as they could. But they hadn't appeared yet at dusk. Everybody in Grover's Corner last night ate dinner by candlelight. Of course, some people couldn't even cook dinner at home because they had electric stoves, so they went out to restaurants. Aunt Mabel has a bottle gas stove, so it didn't make much difference at our house. The Glasses have an electric stove, but Mr. Glass grilled a steak outside on a charcoal grill. Mr. Glass had planned to do some work on a scientific paper that he's writing, but since there weren't any lights, he decided to take the family to the outdoor movies, and they invited me to go along. The power company worked fast, and by the time we got back from the movies, there were lights again.